related to better citizenship, let's say creating better citizens through the education system, but not only. And about 3 years ago, and that was probably the most important contact I had, let's say, with this area that deals with defense, we were involved in a lengthier process coordinated by the presidential administration in elaborating a new strategy for national defense right after President Iohannis was elected at the end of 2014. And our goal, our role in that process was to help on scientific grounds to expand the definition and the scope and the understanding of the idea of security and defense in general, from the traditional approach that deals primarily with the military and the idea of conventional or traditional threats and war, to vulnerabilities and issues that fuel threats on the longer run, like issues related to migration, the fact that so many of us are leaving this country without no clear idea if they want to come back or if they want to contribute to the Romanian society in the future, even if they're abroad. Vulnerabilities coming from the faults of the education system. Vulnerabilities coming from the current faults, quite short term, of the healthcare system, infrastructure, the fact that so many of us are dying on the roads because the state itself, politicians, cannot put it together and actually build safer roads for all of us. So this approach that we tried to have then came very well in line with the approach of the presidency, and this is probably why we managed to work so well together. So this is how I come around this topic of defense and security. Secondly, coming back to my own field of interest and competence, and to what I teach at university. So I deal with policies of representation. Basically that means interaction and studying political parties, electoral systems, the behavior of those who are elected or appointed in public office, and fundamentally about how parties, which again are fundamental to any representative democracy, manage to recruit their human resources. And having this in mind, and with this background, coming back to my interactions with those that elaborate policies that deal with defense and foreign policy in Romania, I am quite worried, and even beyond those topics, because I see, and I don't mean to use strong words, but I see that parties, let's say, have a big issue in finding out the right filters, internal filters, because, as a footnote, and that's a good thing for any democracy, it's virtually impossible to establish through law the kind of people that parties recruit. So parties, mainstream parties, newer parties, have a lot of trouble in finding those proper filters, internal filters, in order to recruit people that later on elaborate policies. And when it comes to the topic that Professor Clarke is going to approach today, which is also very important for Romania as a state, because let's remember in a nutshell that we try to present ourselves as a state as a pillar of stability in the region, as a loyal ally to the United States, to NATO, as a loyal partner within the European Union and so on, so a pillar of security if you like. The people that need to elaborate policies and that speak about those topics on behalf of the Romanian state are very often not that well equipped to do so. And thirdly, and my final point, coming back to my quality here as a political scientist, as a social scientist, and this is something I try to pass on to my students as often as I can. It is very important to know what we're talking about, and what I like very much about the kind of discourse that Professor Clarke has is the way he approaches important concepts. Words, big words like war and peace, that are being thrown around public discourse all the time by media, by various analysts, and very often by politicians in the way that I previously mentioned, very often not knowing exactly what they are talking about. I think, again, it is extremely important to know what we are dealing with when we are speaking about these topics, because we already know, even if we're not specialists, that threats are all over around us, that we are in a very sensitive region here, that the world itself is going through some very troubled times where, world order as we knew it is being extremely tested these days from various sides, and that many of the let's say established teams or loyalties that we are counting on in the international sphere, international relations, are no longer that fixed or settled on the long run. So precisely because these are extremely important topics, we need people like Professor Clarke that actually know what they're talking about, and we need them as often as we can in setups like this. And I know there are politicians among us, but I was actually hoping that there would be more politicians in positions of decision making that would get to hear this kind of speeches. And we need people like Professor Clarke who are academics, who have a long background in studying these topics, who teach these topics, who are well in line with the theoretical developments on such topics, to work with state institutions, with decision makers, and this is exactly what he is doing at home. He has been working with the government for a long time, with the parliament for a long time. He is advisor to the parliament, to the government, even nowadays, and while being an academic at the same time. So from that perspective, I have to say, and I'm not saying that just to flatter him, that you're a role model to myself and to my colleagues, because this is exactly the kind of work we are trying to do. So to be academics, to provide some scientific background to our ideas and to the kind of messages we are trying to pass on to decision makers, and interact with them as often as we can. So you are the kind of academic that gets out of the bubble of the ivory tower, and you are actually engaging with those who have to enact decisions that affect citizens later on. Initially, I had in mind to give you the floor with a question related to the title of your presentation, if we are actually at war nowadays, but you actually responded to a question like that last year in the intervention that you had around this event, and I believe you said something like, if we were at war, we would know it. But maybe we are at a different kind of war. And this is actually, I think, the starting point. What is war nowadays, when most of our lives, or a big part of our lives, is taking place online, to move on to the idea of cyber? And how can we deal with it? What can we do about it?
Thank you very much. Translators? Yes? Thank you. Thank you very much, George, Chairman, for the very kind words of welcome. And it's a great pleasure to be here for a second year and to speak with you in honor of the birthday of Nikolai, of the work of Ion Rațiu and the foundation, and in celebration of Romania's emergence in the modern state that we know it in 1918. And it may seem odd that I'm speaking about cyber war, a very 21st century topic, in honor of a 70th birthday and a centenary anniversary of the country. But I make no apology for that, because history is intrinsically important to understand the present. It's very important that we understand our history, or anyone's history, if we're trying to understand our place in the world in the present day. And history is not an account of what happened in the past. It isn't that. History is the story we tell ourselves about what happened in the past. It is how we interpret what happened in the past. And for that reason, history is very dangerous. History is dynamite because of that. There's a famous story that goes back to the Bosnian Civil War in the 1990s, where a young Serbian nationalist was speaking in a cafe to an international journalist. And over a coffee, the young Serbian nationalist was saying, look, you don't understand how we've suffered. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and then the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, and then the Ottoman Empire, and then the fascists or the Croats, and then the communists. You've no idea how we suffered. And the journalist said, yes, but that was all years ago. And the young man said, yes, but I only found out about it last week. And that's the point. History is dynamite. History is dangerous, and a mature appreciation of history is essential so that we understand where we are in the present. And for that reason, Romania's history, the history of 1918, is very, very important. I mean, of course, we know international studies. I never specialized in Romania or Southeastern Europe, but I knew that Romania emerged in a pseudo-modern form in 1862 and had independence after the settlement of 1878. And it had a disastrous First World War. In 1914, Romania tried to remain neutral, very strongly neutral, and it was pressurized constantly by the Western Allies to declare war on Germany, which it did in 1916, and declared war on the Axis, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and was completely smashed. The army was devastated by the campaigns that followed, and Romania was forced into the Treaty of Bucharest, which was very humiliating. But then Romania again declared war on the Axis in 1918, seeing the way the wind was blowing, and in reality came out of the war as one of the great winners in Southeastern Europe. So the territory of Romania, we all learned it was big Romania, more than doubled in size, with the proper integration of Moldavia and Wallachia and Transylvania and Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, and there you had the modern Romania. But the fact is it had come out of the First World War, and that First World War was critical, because it's often said that if Napoleon had somehow been brought back to life in 1914 or 1915 and surveyed Europe and the world, he wouldn't have been a bit surprised. He would have understood everything that was happening. He would have understood the weapons, the tactics. He would have understood the countries that were fighting, Germany and Britain and Austria-Hungary and Italy and Russia. No problem. He would have understood what they were doing in the rest of the world, and he would have understood why they thought they were fighting. It was a 19th century world. But if he'd been brought back to life in some magical way in 1917 or 1918, he wouldn't have had any idea at all about what was happening, because the world changed, click, like that. And that's just what happens when history moves. It's as if the wheel trembles and trembles and trembles, and then click, it changes. And in between 1917 and 1919, the 20th century that we all grew up in, most of us, was laid down. And that 20th century consisted of some of these great forces. The United States became a world power, intervening in the First World War. Notwithstanding 15 years of isolation, the US was in the world. After 1917, Russia became a new sort of state, the Soviet Union, and went out of the system, in effect. But that Russian-American antagonism was one of the things that drove the 20th century along. And the other thing that drove the 20th century along was ideology. Suddenly, the cause for conflict was bounded by a deep, enduring ideological struggle. And a third thing that didn't exist in 1914, but did exist by 1917, was the mobilization of whole societies, the industrialization of warfare. So it was possible to actually create a society that could go to war with every fiber of its being. And that's exactly what Britain did, and Germany did, and Italy and Austria-Hungary. It was the industrialization of warfare. And not least, in between 1917 and 1919, four empires collapsed effectively overnight. And three of them, of course, are very important to Romania: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire. And that process of decolonization was to be a process that drove the 20th century along for the next 70-odd years. And so those four things, the ideological competition, the Russian-American antagonism, the industrialization of warfare, whereby technology was controlled by the state, and technology got bigger and bigger because the state could run the technology, and decolonization. They were the great forces of 20th century politics. And that was the conditions in which modern Romania was born. Now, the 20th century was a pretty vicious century. 110 million people were killed in wars through the 20th century. Another 50 million people were killed by Spanish flu between 1918 and 1921. 50 million, that was 2.6% of the global population, because that population had been weakened by the effect of war. So 110 million war deaths, 50 million deaths through the pandemic of Spanish flu. And it's often been said that the 20th century will go down to, in future historians' words, as the Long War. a war that began in 1914 and did not finish till 1991. It was 77 years of war because it was a war, effectively a three-sided war of ideologies. It was liberal capitalism, represented by America, but also with Britain and France, as we're hoping that America would champion the cause more actively in the early days. So liberal capitalism versus fascism versus communism. And that three-sided war went on for 77 years, through first of all the rise of fascism, to the defeat of fascism in 1945, a stunning but a very expensive victory, and then a second phase, a more bloodless victory between liberal democracy and communism, in which liberal democracy triumphed in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the nightmare of Ceausescu, and in 1991 the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the creation of 15 successor states instead of one Soviet Union. So in a way, the 20th century lasted from 1914, but really 1917 to 1991. And it was a hard, tough, nasty century with all the progress that we had. And that 20th century came to an end, as I say, by 1991, but it was already ending. It was ending by the late 1970s and 1980s, because the things that I described, the ideology, the way technology was being used, the decolonization process, they'd all more or less run their course by the late 70s, early 80s. Technology is a very interesting one that works its way through. In Anglo-American literature, we talk a lot about George Orwell, the great English novelist who wrote 1984 about totalitarian society. And his view was that the machinery, technology would get bigger and bigger, controlled by the state. So eventually the state will control every waking moment of the population. Now he wrote 1984 in 1948. That's what he did. He reversed the numerals. It was published in 1948. And it was a logical thing to think in 1948 at the end of the Second World War. But in 1948, the transistor was invented. And the transistor was that little piece of technology that began to make technology smaller and smaller and smaller. Until now, most of us have inside our cheap digital watches more computing power than went to the moon in 1969 or is involved or was involved in some of the biggest military programs of 20 years ago. So technology changed all through the 50s and 60s, but it really came to a peak in the 1980s. The internet is not invented until 1983, 1985, and by 1990 it's fundamentally changing our lives in all sorts of ways. So the 20th century began in a very specific bang in 1917, and it ended in a more vague way in the late 70s, early 80s. And the 21st century that we've now lived through for 30 years, not 18 years, we've had 30 years of the 21st century in a political sense. That 21st century is dominated by what we normally refer to as the power of globalization, the globalized world. And that globalized world is built on, from our point of view, I think two very fundamental things that we take for granted too easily. The first is the speed of communication. Of course, speed of communication. Just think about this for a moment. For 8,000 years of human history, we know that human beings have existed and have engaged in activity, basic farming, for 8,000 years. We have records, one way or another, for 3,000 years. For the vast majority of the period of human history, the speed of human travel did not alter. It didn't increase gradually, it didn't increase at all. Nobody could move faster than the speed of the horse. Nobody could cross the seas faster than the wind would carry them. So the speed of communication was constant for 8,000 years until the 1830s. And so it took Julius Caesar the same amount of time to send a message from northern France to Italy, to Rome, and get a reply, as it would have taken Napoleon to send a message from northern France to Italy and get a reply. So the tempo of politics, the speed with which things happened, was completely constant. And the tempo of politics has a great deal to do with the assumptions we make about politics, about what is important and what isn't, how authority works, how people communicate with each other. And then, of course, in the 1830s, the railways arrive, and that revolutionizes warfare, for one thing. American Civil War, First World War, dominated by the railways and the power of countries to get troops to a breakdown area quickly. and then the internal combustion engine arrives, and then the telegraph and radio, right through to computing. And here we are now on the verge of a new generation of computing. Moore's law still exists. Moore's law is that the idea, and it still works, is that every 18 months the memory power in computing doubles. Every 18 months. That still is in existence, but processors are becoming almost subatomic. They're tiny, they're getting down to the atomic level. We seem to be on the verge of a new revolution of quantum computing, which is using subatomic particles. Now the basis of this, of course, is that a particle can either be 1 or 0. That's the way computing works, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. And that gives you a logic chain, and a computer does a series of calculations very, very quickly. A subatomic particle can be either 1 or 0 simultaneously. And so it can do simultaneous calculations and is up to 100 million times faster. I'll say that again, 100 million times faster than the fastest computer that we now have. The problem of using subatomic particles is that they're not stable because they don't always behave in the same way. So if you ask a quantum computer, as already exists, what is 2 and 2, sometimes it will say 2 and 2 is 2. It won't say 2 and 2 is 4. But if it's a quantum computer, you can ask it 100 times in an instant, and it will give you the answer that it's achieved 85 out of those 100 times. So quantum computing already exists. It's very simplistic. But in the next 30 years, if quantum computing becomes practical, it may or it may not, but if it becomes practical, then it will knock all present computing out of the window in terms of encryption. Everything that is encrypted can be decrypted very quickly. It will be a new generation of computing, and it will be weaponized by the major powers. So the first thing about the globalized world that we've got to remember is that the revolution in communications is about as fundamental as we can imagine. Everything that we thought we knew about politics, about political philosophy, about authority structures is potentially changed by the power of communication. Not just messages, but knowledge. The universality of knowledge, the inability to keep anything to yourself if you put it down electronically. And the second thing that was important about our present age is the assumptions we made in 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was replaced by 15 successor states, there was a lot of assumptions in the West that, well, that is it now, it's all finished. Francis Fukuyama wrote a very influential article in the United States which went around everywhere called The End of History. And then he wrote a book called The End of History and the Last Man. And typical of America, it was a great title. Everybody said they'd read it, but nobody had. But what it was really all about, but what he was onto was the idea of this. He said that the antagonism about liberal democracy versus communism, liberal democracy versus fascism, that's all gone. And the fact is, liberal democracy and capitalism is a fact of life. It's not a choice, it just exists. And the nature of the next era that we're moving into is whether other states can adjust to it. We are the liberal capitalists, we've won the battles, they've got to adjust to what we know is the fact of life. And in 1991, that seemed a fairly trenchant, but nevertheless accurate statement of the situation. Now, as it happened, I suspect that in the long run, I think Francis Fukuyama will prove to be right. I think that liberal democratic capitalism is the default option when you've tried everything else and it doesn't work. I think that's what you tend to go back to. But in the last 20 years, he has not been right because Western liberal capitalism is on the retreat. There is a new ideology in political Islam which takes both violent and non-violent forms, and that is actually becoming more important in the world. There's a significant pushback against freewheeling Western capitalism in Russia, and a really important pushback in China, where a essentially capitalist society is still run by a one-party communist state. That's not supposed to exist. In all of our politics history, in all of our politics textbooks, George, I think, will agree, if that works as an experiment, we'll have to rewrite all the books. That's not supposed to be allowed. You cannot be a one-party communist state and operate a successful capitalist system. It's not true. Can't be. Well, a quarter of the world's population are trying it as an experiment, so we'll see. So there's quite a big pushback. And in 2008, the economic crisis, which began as a banking crisis and then turned in 2010 into a crisis of the real economies of the Western world. That crisis was not only an economic crisis from which we have not yet properly recovered, it was also a crisis of confidence, because suddenly our economics didn't look very good at all. And as we've seen in the electoral politics that we've had in Europe and in the Western world since 2010, by and large they've been pretty bad. And it is no accident that in Moscow and Beijing, in a way the leaderships just say to the people, is this really what you want? Do you really want politics that look like those that elected Donald Trump? Or do you really want the politics that have spread across Europe, where populism seems to have destabilized what were the old orders? Do you really want the chaos that these things have created? And so democracy is in retreat. And understanding the cyber world that we now live in, I think it's very important to understand the history of where it has come from and the situation that we now exist. So, in the final part of my remarks, let me address peace and war in the cyber age. And the headline in talking about this is that the 21st century is in many respects the best century we have ever had in the last 3,000 years of recorded history. This is in many respects a great time to live, but it is also a time of more uncertainty and more fear than we were used to, even in that violent, difficult 20th century. That's the essential headline, I think, that I want to leave you with. 21st century is very good, but it doesn't always feel very good because we feel as if it's careering out of control. In the 20th century, that was a dangerous time, but we felt that there was some sort of control over what was happening. In the 21st century, now, we're not sure anything is under control, is even within the realms of the predictable. So let me just deal with each of those in turn. First of all, the peace of the 21st century. If we think about the warfare as it now exists, it runs in an arc which you could draw on a map. An arc from West Africa through to East Africa, through to the Middle East, through to South Asia. And that arc contains about 1 billion people. It is an arc of war and conflict that covers about 1 billion of the world's population. That's serious. But remember, the world population is 7 billion, just reached 7 billion. So 6 out of 7 people in the world are not living under the shadow of war, but 1 billion people are. When the Colombian government concluded a peace deal with the FARC guerrillas a couple of years ago, and that peace deal is a bit delicate, it needs to be strengthened, but there is no conflict whatsoever anywhere in the Americas. There are no civil wars, there are no international wars, there are no major civil disturbances anywhere from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. And you look again at Central Asia and East Asia, there are tensions, there are difficulties. The Rohingya Muslims in Burma is a major issue. But war is not a characteristic at the moment in the 21st century. And then look at some of the, as it were, the underlying figures. If we think about extreme poverty, the World Bank describes extreme poverty as those people who live on less than $1.90 a day, just under $2 a day. Anyone who has to live on just under $2 a day is classed as living in extreme poverty. Just look at what's happened to the figures. In 1980, the number of people in the world who are classed as living at under $2 a day was 45%. 1980, that was the end of the 20th century in effect. In 2016, it's 10%, only 10%, but distributed very unevenly. If you look at China, in 1990, 67% of the Chinese population lived in extreme poverty under that classification. 67% in 1990. In 2016, 1%. That's astonishing, 1%. In India, it was 45% in 1990, it's 20% in 2016. These are staggering advances in wealth, or in basic wealth. More than 60 million people every year become middle class, according to World Bank definitions. They enter a level of income which makes them middle class. We can argue about what that really means, but of course then they want different sorts of diet, they have a different taste, they have money to buy other things than some of the basics. 60 million people every year, that's the size of Britain. That's 3 times the size of Romania. Every year, those people move up the scale. And another figure, which is always, I think, quite interesting, is infant mortality. Because infant mortality tells you a lot about a system. When fewer children are dead at birth, that means that the mothers have got access to clean water. It means that some of their food is basically all right. It means there's a certain amount of medical support. It means that they have got some knowledge as mothers of what pregnancy entails. It's actually quite a good symbol for other aspects of a health system. And again, without going into lots of the detail, if you look in world politics terms, in 1990, the infant mortality rate across the world, very uneven, but across the world on average, was 100 per 1,000 live births. So 100 deaths per 1,000 live births. That's 10%. In 2016, it's 48, which is 4.8%. So it's gone down to less than 5% from 1990 to 2016. And that figure has never gone the other way. The infant mortality figure has only ever gone down. It has never ever gone up. It's always gone down. So, wherever you look, the 21st century is actually a healthy, good century in which to live, and it's a century which is not blighted by enormous examples of warfare. But, right, here's the other side of it. Of course, it is a century that makes us feel insecure. Now, why does it do that? Two main reasons. One is the politics and the other is the technology. The politics is that we now have four great powers who have emerged in this period since 2001, 2008. And the four great powers have begun to compete in a very old-fashioned way. America, Russia, China, and India. Those are the four great powers of world politics. And they compete across the board in military, in economic terms, in technology terms, and in cyber terms. And it is often said that there are 6 and now 7 domains of warfare. You know, if you're a military officer, you have to think in terms of warfare in at least 6 and probably 7 different ways. And those domains of warfare are under the sea, you know, submaritime, on the sea, on land, on air, in space, and in cyber. Those are 6 domains of warfare. And the 7th domain is information. The domain of warfare which tries to rewrite everyone's history. The domain of warfare that tries to change what we believe are the stories in the past that we should hold on to. So there are, if you like, 7 domains of warfare. Undersea, sea, land, space, air, and cyber, and information. And those 7 domains of warfare are domains which those 4 big powers, America, Russia, China, and India, are now competing in very vigorously. And it's as if the great geopolitical wheels of world politics are turning now very quickly. And those wheels that are turning leave less space for those of us in Europe to exist in between, to actually pursue our own interests, to try to maintain ourselves. Those wheels turn, and they don't leave a whole lot of space for us. And so that's one major reason why we feel that the world is not as much in control as it was even in the dangerous 20th century. And the other reason is technology. Those technologies which the military are enacting are not really so much about weapons. Of course, weapons are important. You know, they used to say that one of the problems for the centuries until the mid-20th century for a military man or military officer was that you always knew where the enemy was. The question was, could you destroy the enemy? You know, there was no question about where the other army was, even if they were quick and trying to get round your flank. You always basically knew where they were. The question was, could you destroy them? The problem now is the other way around. You know you can destroy them if only you can find them, right? But you don't know where they are. You actually don't know where, are they in a city? Are they civilians? Are they military? Who are they? Are they guerrillas? Are they terrorists? If you could define the enemy, if you could find the enemy, you can always destroy them. Modern technology is extremely destructive, but you can't always find the enemy. And the technologies that the military concentrate on now are known in the jargon, I'm sorry translators about this jargon, it's called C4 I-STAR. And the C4, C to the power of 4, is command, control, communication, and computing. That's C4. And I-STAR is intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance. Right? So C4 I-STAR. Right? Command, control, computing, communication, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance. C4 I-STAR. And those powers, and the European powers have quite a lot of this. That's what the military are concentrating on. But there are 4 other technologies which are just out there and are beginning to have an effect. And those technologies are robotics, the ability to build robots, not just aircraft and drones, but there's a Russian tank now, which is a robot tank. There's nobody inside it, and it's a very effective and very destructive piece of equipment, and all powers will have robot elements very, very soon. So robotics is one. Artificial intelligence is a second one, the ability to find out a great deal about the opposition and who they are and how they break themselves down. But there are two more technologies which are just a bit further away, which are equally troubling. One of them is nanotechnology, the ability to make things very, very small. And so already, you can see this in Hollywood films, but already there are drones the size of half of your thumb, and it is possible that a modern aircraft like an F-35, which the United States has and Israel has and Britain is buying and some of the other European powers are thinking about, that an F-35 could actually could fly stealthily without being detected on radar inside somebody's battle space and release 100,000 little drones which would swamp the territory. And they'll all send back the same information. So one way or another, you will get the information. Nobody will actually stop 100,000 little hornets. So that's sort of the nanotechnology. And that's only one obvious example. Nanotechnology is one. And the final one that is worth worrying about is genetic engineering. We're on the verge of the ability to affect only certain genetic characteristics of people that might be infected by a gas or by a contamination in the food or the water supply. It is already possible to affect the agriculture of another country. And genetic engineering is on the verge of a series of breakthroughs. Nobody knows how this could be weaponized. We just don't know. We don't really know how nanotechnology will be effectively weaponized. But the point is that that weaponization will take place for sure in America, in Russia, in China, and eventually in India. It won't take place in Europe because we can't do it, we're not big enough, and we're not interested enough. But we come to a situation in the 2020s when states like Romania and Italy and France and Britain will face a world in which the big four are pursuing forms of warfare or forms of competition which are not concerned with throwing weapons at each other, but affecting each other's society through cyber and computing and through nanotechnology, possibly through genetic engineering, certainly through artificial intelligence. We're on the cusp of that world. And that is a very disturbing world in which to live. So, the 21st century is something to celebrate in lots of ways. The peace, the health, the benefits that we have are tremendous, and we should never forget that. But what worries us about the 21st century is that we feel this could all be a sort of careering, out of control dash towards technologies and politics which could bring it all down in a fit of human misery that would make the 20th century look comparatively good. That's what worries us. What can we do about it? Well, I've got no bright answers to this. I've got no fundamental answers. But one thing I'm sure about is that in dealing with the problems of cyber bullying, of cyber warfare, of fake news, of the rewriting of our history, which we see all around us, that it all comes down to a personal level. And what my answer to this is that I have to have faith in democracy. For me, democracy is about legitimacy. And in Western Europe, and Europe as a whole, other parts of the world, North America, democracy is our form of legitimacy. It's not everyone's form of legitimacy. We made the mistake in the 1990s of assuming that everyone should be democratic. Well, if other societies have forms of organization that they deem as legitimate, then I think we should accept that. It so happens that democracy is our legitimacy. And so legitimacy and democracy are concepts that I think we've got to think about much more, and this is one of the reasons why I'm very happy to speak here. But at a personal level, it comes down to two or three other things. Citizenship, by which I mean the thinking about being in a community, whether that is the community of a city or a country or a region or an economic community, whatever. Citizenship, it exists at several levels, and people have got to have a sense of citizenship. Integrity, personal integrity, not in the sense that people are completely personally honest. I mean, we all have our dishonesties which we're drawn into one way or another. But by integrity, I mean a value on truth, an ability to look for the truth and to value truth as opposed to authenticity and feeling. We live in a world in which people think if I feel it, that's good enough. Well, no, it isn't good enough. You may feel something, but you've got to know it. So you may feel a false sense of grief because a footballer has died or whatever. Think about what it is. Feeling is not enough. It needs some facts as well. It needs integrity. It needs a value of truth. And not least, compassion. If people are compassionate, they won't go far wrong. And those elements that I've mentioned, democracy and legitimacy, and those personal elements, citizenship, integrity and compassion, if we can hold on to those values, then I think that we can begin, certainly in democracies, to get back to that old idea that we live in the democracies we deserve, or we get the governments we deserve. If we hold those personal values, eventually, in the long run, we will get the governments that we better deserve. And I can think of no better place to consider citizenship, integrity and compassion, democracy and legitimacy than in the weekend that we now have in the Rațiu Foundation and here now, and I'm very glad to do it. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't know about you guys, but I listened like a happy student, so it feels good to go back on the other side from time to time and have the privilege of being part of events like this, or the target of speeches like this one. Many things that Professor Clarke has raised here, many things that have been said, and a lot of food for thought, I think, for the time that we have now together in this event, but also beyond this. And since I have the privilege of holding the microphone before I pass it on to you for questions and comments to what has been said, and I think that there has, again, have been a lot of issues raised here, and I assume it's going to be quite a fruitful discussion. Just a few insights that I had in mind when I was listening. I'm really happy that you sent across messages that deal with not only with the threats and, again, the vulnerabilities and this feeling of uncertainty that we need to deal with as citizens of Romania, of Europe, of the world in general, but the fact that this is also a matter of responsibility. And very often, as I did in my introduction remarks, we refer to the responsibilities that political elites have when it comes to decision making that later on impact everyone, but it is also a matter of responsibility for each and every one of us as citizens. And if we have in mind the idea of how we construct better political elites, we also need to have in mind equally, or maybe even more important, how we manage to have better citizens across time. And I think, just to tie a little bit this discussion to the one towards the end of the previous panel, probably the best answer, maybe the only answer to this, is education, which takes place across several levels, the education system being one of them, but not the only one. The bad news, that's the good news. The bad news is that education takes time, that's true. And these feelings of uncertainty and the threats that we need to face and the challenges that we need to face, need to find answers now. Then at the level of the political system, yeah, democracy is great. And here in Europe and we in Romania including, although even today we see that there are plenty of reasons for us to feel, unhappy with the way democracy is behaving, generally speaking, at the level of our state. But democracy itself and this kind of political system that we live in is the result of tens of years of evolution in how politics is being done. And we need to protect that because we see how easy it is to switch to something else. At the same time, we are trying to, or embedded in this kind of political behavior, is the idea of predictability, of long-term thinking, or that should be the case. Yet we need to find answers to very specific and immediate threats, some of them even impossible to anticipate, through very slow means. which are specific to conventional politics. So conventional or unconventional threats that need to be met through conventional means. So probably this is why we have this feeling of unsafety, even though we look around us and we see so many good things happening and a lot of the progress that you mentioned, that is visible and we can feel it if we think about it in our own lives, yet we are somewhat unhappy still. And what can we do about that? So these are just thoughts that crossed my mind when I was listening to it. There were more than that, but I don't want to take over too much of the time. So that being said, I'll actually walk around and pass the microphone. And who wants to start the session of questions?
I'd like to thank Professor Clarke for a wonderful, instructive, but also entertaining lecture. My name's Dennis Delatant, and I hold the Rațiu chair. I have the honor of holding the Rațiu chair at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. My question, Professor Clarke, is to focusing more in the geographical area in which we're in. Do you feel that countries in East Central Europe can do more to protect themselves against the growing threat posed by cybersecurity and its use by powers which are doing their best to destabilize societies?
Thank you, yes. And the answer is yes, we all can. One fundamental issue about cybersecurity, bringing it down to the sort of policy questions, is that basic cyber hygiene is critical and would actually account for 90% of the cyber insecurity that exists in the Western world. It's rather like personal hygiene was to public health in the late 19th century. As soon as people realized that personal hygiene was actually very important, public health improved tremendously in the early decades of the 20th century. And it's as if we've got to redo that lesson. We say, look, cyber hygiene is fundamental to your security, not just your security at a national level, but your security from criminals, from people using your identity, from people getting into your account. So that would account for, or that would take care of about 90% of the insecurities that presently exist within the Western world. But then there are at least two other areas which are very important. And one is Romania has a good record, and one is it has a poor record. The one good thing from Romania's point of view is that most of the Western world's real insecurities, beyond the hygiene issue, are in critical national infrastructure. I mean, in Britain we worry a lot about the degree to which our critical national infrastructure is already vulnerable because it's based on very old-fashioned security protocols of 10 and 20 years ago, which can very easily be jumped. The United States is in an even worse situation. It is widely believed, and nobody can seem to get this through to either the last president or the present president, that America's CNI is already consists of time bombs waiting to go off. Some of them by accident, some of them can be deliberately created. And it wouldn't be difficult to create a real problem with that. There is a case of a defense establishment being penetrated in America because of hacking of the street lights that were around it. You get into the system of the street lights, and you can jump into the facility itself. So it's not even the facilities which have to be secure; it's things that lead into the facilities, and the computerized ordering system of the outside caterers that come in to do things in the facilities, and so on and so forth. So there are widespread problems in Romania. The infrastructure is not as computerized; it's not as sophisticated. It is easier to protect it than it is for West European countries or the United States. All of that, I think, is to the advantage, but that's one of the big challenges. And then the second, final point about this is that there is a big political challenge, because we know that the two biggest countries that are, as it were, weaponizing cyber insecurities are Russia and China, and they do it in quite different ways, and believe me, I've got personal experience of this. Having run a defence think tank in Whitehall in London, I can give you chapter and verse on how this works from my personal point of view, or the point of view of my institute that I had to deal with. But Russia and China are the two big cyber hacking governments in the world, and Russia in particular uses Southeastern Europe. They use the Western Balkans a lot, Montenegro and Serbia and Croatia, and I think Romania, as points to create, as it were, apparently private hackers who are actually working to a Moscow agenda and in some cases a Beijing agenda. And that's something which politically I think as in Europe we have to grasp. The European Commission has started on that road with the General Data Protection Regulation, which tries to give people more control over their personal data, but it's the beginning of a long road, and it will be a long road, and we'll have to keep on doing it for the next however many years that this century lasts in a political sense, however long the 21st century turns out to be.
Thank you, Professor Durden, for the question and for the answer. There was another question.
Professor, you didn't mention the United Nations in your talk. Is it passed its sell-by date, or has it got a role to play?
Yeah, it's not everyone is. We've said that about the UN since 1950, and the point is that the UN is the home of lost causes. If everything else fails, it goes to the UN. So if the pirates can't sort it out between them, if they can't come up with a deal, they throw it at the UN, and the UN gets the most intractable of problems, so they can sit somewhere. And the UN has achieved universality. So more or less everyone is in the UN. 195 states now, I think, in the General Assembly. There's only 5 or 6 territories which really are not in the UN. And remember, that's something that the League of Nations never managed. The League of Nations tried to stand on its dignity, on its ability to enforce the rule of law within the group of nations, within the Society of Nations, and the lawbreakers just left. So, Italy left, and Japan left, and Germany left, and the League of Nations collapsed effectively by 1937. The United Nations, despite everything, keeps going. So if the UN were abolished tomorrow, we would try to invent something to do the same thing. And on the completely positive side, the UN does a great deal in terms of economic development, not always correctly, but it's better that it does it than not, on culture, on minority rights, on human rights. I say that with inverted commas because the Human Rights Council is a joke, but it should do it. And the United Nations provides a forum for smaller nations. The big countries don't need a forum because everybody listens to what the Americans say and the Russians say and the Chinese and the Indians say. But not many people listen to what the Costa Ricans say, or even what the Uruguayans say, or the Chileans. And so the United Nations is a forum in which people listen and have to listen to the views of everybody. So that universality is important. And the UN, as it were, has peaks and troughs in terms of its effectiveness. And at sometimes, when the great powers agree that something needs to be done, they turn to the UN to implement it. And that's when we should be very grateful that the UN exists. But like many people in this room, I've worked for the UN on one of the committees, and working there really tests your commitment to the ideal. It really does. But nevertheless, I came away still committed to the ideal, but more realistically so.
I read the other day that Bill Clinton said that the only way to have a fair election nowadays was to go back to paper.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true?
It would be a good fail-safe mechanism, actually, but to go back to paper doesn't guarantee fair elections. In Britain's Northern Ireland province, we've had troubles in Northern Ireland since 1922, the foundation of the Republic of Ireland state, and the famous phrase in Northern Ireland over many years was, on election day, vote early and often. That's what they always say, early and often. So paper doesn't solve the problem, but it makes it much more difficult. But I think that the problem of voter fraud by electronic means is not nearly as much of a problem as the problem of using electronic means to sway votes, to sway the opinion. And what has clearly taken place over the last 10 years, because of AI, because of artificial intelligence, and the ability to marshal huge amounts of information for nothing, for almost nothing, just the cost of the people doing it. No, it doesn't cost anything to store millions and millions and millions of pieces of information. It costs nothing to store it and to interrogate it. And because of that, the influence on electoral debates, which go far beyond the national debate that will take place within the country, that's what's most damaging. And that's not going to change, of course, by going back to paper votes. But I know what Bill Clinton was, what he meant is that maybe we should step back and rethink what we want our electoral politics to do. Because America has always been out there in the lead of technology in political, in elections. They've always used artificial intelligence more keenly than everyone else in the past. They invented many electoral systems that try to get your votes out and to denigrate the opposition. So in a way, what's happened in America is almost the wheel coming full circle, that America now seems to be most affected by the putting elections thoroughly through the media rather than through individual candidates. And for what it's worth, people often ask me, is Donald Trump, will they find evidence of Donald Trump and the involvement of the Russians? Well, I don't think any of it will stick. I don't think that there is a smoking gun which goes back to Donald Trump himself. I'm sure, from what I know, that it goes back to his campaign, but he may be able to claim credibly that he did not know, and nobody, I think, will be able to prove that he did know that his campaign people were talking to the Russians during the campaign, talking to the Russian government and making promises. But it will dog him for the whole of his presidency. Whether it's 4 years or 8 years, he will not shake this off, even though I don't think it will come to a single conclusion.
There was another hand raised there, and then Koran. But besides Donald Trump, let me just add this shows the challenges that such an episode poses not only to Trump as president or as a politician, but to the overall process, and how that diminishes the confidence that the electorate, the voters, have in the process itself. And I think that is the huge issue here.
Well, thank you so much. I guess we all agreed that for next year's Mr. Rațiu's birthday, we should celebrate it in Costa Rica, since it's the other country.
Thank you.
It's my home country, so there you go. You're more than invited. Well, the report of CIPRI came out very recently, and we're talking about 1.7 trillion in the world in weapon industry. Yeah. And as you just mentioned, and obviously the causes, China and Central Europe and East Europe has been one of the major buyers, so to say, and the ones who are spending more budget according to this report. How can you weigh in this, and how can you tell also the many politicians that we are surrounded to? Yeah. Because this is, as a citizen, this is the money that is expended in the government, right? It seems like there's no conflicts per se, but the money is outrageous. And the second thing is, I would like to have your opinion on, we, the civil society, feel unsafe with the whole scandal of Cambridge Analytica and seeing now Facebook putting in the scrutiny. What should we do as a society, right? Because now we don't even feel safe in cyber, in the technological world, and there's a lot of security going on for cyber security, but it doesn't seem that these bigger companies are going to change their models in the near future.
Yes, thank you. On the question of expenditure, you're absolutely right. I mean, I saw the headline of the CIPRI report. I haven't read this year's book yet, but about $1.7 trillion on military equipment in the world, and the proportions don't change very much. About 2/3 of that is the United States and its Western allies, and about 1/3 of that is everyone else, including China and Russia and all the other countries in the world. And I mean, Russian military spending is less than 5% of all the military spending in the world. It's not as if they spend 30% or 40%, 5%, less than 5%. And the point is they spend it in ways that worry Western Europe and some aspects of the United States, because they spend it on modernizing their nuclear weapons and on new submarines and new aircraft and various other things. But most people would believe that China and Russia spend more money than anyone else on military hardware, and they don't. They spend their money trying to frustrate the effect of American military spending most of the time. In the jargon, it's called A2AD, which is anti-area access denial, which is the idea you can't beat the opposition, but you can stop them coming into your area. And that's what the Chinese are trying to do in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, is to create the military hardware that will make it too dangerous for the Americans to send ships or fly aircraft into that area. So A2AD, anti-area access denial. And sorry? Yeah, and in Europe as well, and around the Baltic states, A2AD, it's the latest fashion in Western worry. But you're absolutely right that the public in the Western world ought to have more of a say in what they think about this, what they think about the amount of money that is being spent on the military. There are 27 million people in the world in uniform, 27 million, most of them doing nothing useful. Right? Most of them are hopeless, they're incompetent, and most of them are a danger to their own societies. I've tried to work it out. Of those 27 million people, how many of them would you say are competent? Would you actually trust to do a job, military or otherwise? And I think about 5 million out of the 27. If you look at the armies in the world, or the militaries in the world that you would trust to go and do something and do it properly, reasonably properly, it's about 5 million. There's 22 million doing nothing. They're thugs in uniform, and many of them are acting as thuggish policemen in their own societies. And so somehow we've got to keep talking about that. We spoke about it quite a lot in the 20th century because of the Cold War, but it was always overlaid with ideology. Now that we're not living in a world of such ideology, we should see it for what it is. We are paying as citizens a great deal of money for a lot of people to wear uniform, and otherwise they'd be out of a job, so they're in uniform, doing nothing much in particular. And I think we've got to think about it. I've got no clever ideas as to how to reduce it by half, other than for the public in the world to be aware of it. And in a way, it's the same answer when you talk about, how do we cope with Cambridge Analytica and, the role that these companies play. Incidentally, there's a company called Oxford Analytica, which has existed for many years, which I used to know quite well. It was set up by Richard Davey, who was a Times journalist back in the 1970s. And Cambridge Analytica, about 5 years ago, established themselves and used the Oxford Analytica idea. So they said, oh, well, there's Oxford Analytica. We'll call ourselves Cambridge Analytica. And now they've basically undermined everything that Oxford Analytica have tried to do, which is completely different. Oxford Analytica are just a research organisation, and a very good one. And their brand has been contaminated by this group of cowboys called Cambridge Analytica, led by Andrew Nix, who say no more. But how to deal with that goes back to what I was saying at the end of my talk. There may be a swing of the pendulum where ordinary people suddenly feel insecure because of what is happening in Facebook and with Google, and the way in which, remember that the economic models for particularly Facebook and Twitter and Google are that we are not the customers, we are the product. The customers are the advertisers. That's who pays the money to Facebook and Google. So we are the product. And in order to keep that product fresh, Facebook and Google have to find out more and more about us so they can keep selling it to the advertisers. And so it's intrinsic to their business model for them to get deeper and deeper into our lives. Now, at some point, I suspect, there will be a reaction against that. I'd like to think it was beginning now. But it comes back to what I said before, that citizenship, integrity, that is concern for truth, not just for feelings, and compassion. If we held on to those three virtues, then I think that swing of the pendulum would come sooner rather than later. I think that's the best I can do on it, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Hearing you talk about the weaponizable technological prowess currently held by certain states, hunting metaphor comes to mind. So I understand the point of view of the hound, but I would like the fox to have a sporting chance. So my question is, under these conditions, do we need to rethink the social contract? How can citizens have a sporting chance against the government that they cannot overthrow, because the government can destroy them, as you said, at any point?
Yeah, Yeah, no, I mean, there are some very disturbing tendencies in that respect. I didn't mention it in my talk, but one thing that I would like to draw attention to, nothing to do with Europe, is that in China's northwest province, in Xinjiang province, where the Uyghur people, the Muslims, the Muslim Uyghurs, the Chinese government is using cyber power to control the lives of the Uyghur people, who are the majority in Xinjiang, despite the fact that the Chinese have tried to move Han peoples in there. And this is a good example of an authoritarian government using the technologies that Mark Zuckerberg and people like this and Bill Gates all thought were liberating technologies. They're now using that technology towards real oppression. It's almost a genocidal oppression run through cyberspace, and that's very disturbing. And in that respect, so what could the Uyghur people do? I don't know, except become unelectronic, as it were, try and delete their electronic signatures. But now even that causes suspicion. Why aren't you on this system? Why have you not downloaded this app, which is government approved from Beijing? So it is very difficult. In Europe, I think that we do have the ability to keep talking about it. And I think we have got to make clear to the companies, but also to our governments, that we expect there to be, as you say, a level playing field for the fox and the hounds. And we have accepted, because it's arisen so quickly, Facebook and Google. I mean, these companies only go back to 2005, 2007, 2011, some of them. It's very recent. But I think we have to make clear to the companies and our own governments that we expect there to be, as it were, more top-level regulation, but allowing some choice down at the personal level. It is a balance. We don't want the Wild West, because that would lead to a sort of cyber slavery, nor do we want a Chinese model where the government gets hold of the whole thing, and the Russians do the same, and so increasingly in Turkey and in Iran. We don't want that. So there's a balance somewhere, but we don't talk enough about it, and it's a subject for another big meeting, I suspect.
Thank you very much, Doru. Thanks for the opportunity. Michael, it was a very good speech, very enlightening, I would say. And my question comes just listening of your argumentation and your presentation of the evolution across history. And would you have asked me like half an hour ago, for example, what would I think about the warfare and about the cyber warfare? I would have rather said that the cyber warfare is giving the opportunity for individuals to stage their own wars and for the small nations actually to compete against big nations. Now, what you're saying is that also cyber war is dominated by those four powers, and that's why my question would come. How do you see this when actually the cyber world is giving a democratization of the warfare?
Yeah, no, I take the point, and what you're saying is what a lot of analysts were looking at 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, we talk about cyber terrorism. I've done, because I do a lot of work in the UK on terrorism, and we've done quite a lot of looking at this. There's not much evidence of cyber terrorism. There's a lot of evidence that terrorists use cyber to communicate and to propagate ideas and develop expertise. But there's very little evidence that terrorists have been able to use cyber methods of creating some sort of terrorist attack, because by and large terrorists want explosions. They want things which look like awful photographs in the newspapers and on TV. And there isn't much evidence of cyber war. There are a lot of books that you can pick up on airport bookstalls about the cyber war of the future, of how countries will actually just attack each other by bringing down their railway systems, bringing down their water supplies, bringing down aircraft in the air. There's a lot of work has been done on that, and it's not clear that although those things are feasible, that they would serve the political purposes that war is normally regarded as serving. There is a general view amongst analysts, I'm generalizing now, that warfare requires or involves destruction, physical destruction and probably death. And there's only a certain amount of that you can create in a modern society, because societies actually are good at, modern societies can reroute things around it. Modern societies can find ways of coping with problems of the electricity supply or the water supply. They may be very, very inconvenient and they may cause disruption, but that's not the same as a bombing attack. It's not the same as mass death amongst its population. So the idea of cyber warfare has been a little bit overstated, I think, in the last 20 years. But what cyber allows the big powers to do is to unite these domains of warfare that I mentioned, undersea, sea, airspace, and so on. Cyber is the glue that holds together lots of different ways of doing things. And one of the phrases that kicks around now in defense studies is hybrid warfare, whereby warfare is not just only about what the military may be doing, it is about, as it were, changing affecting society, inconveniencing it by attacking the water supply or whatever else, creating a false narrative in the rest of the world about what is happening, trying to change the history of what is happening. And there's a great deal of work now on the way in which cyber capacities are used by big powers as part of their whole suite of competition with each other. Having said that, of course, it is still possible that cyber is a democratizing force for both good and bad. It allows NGOs to develop a global presence. It allows people to share ideas to the good of mankind. And most of what goes on in cyberspace is of that sort. That's exactly what it is. But just the same technologies allow terrorists and criminals to do what they want to do as well. And it allows people to create false narratives and false histories. And one of the dangers of our present cyber existence is what's often regarded, certainly in Britain and America, as the echo chamber. Because people get their news from their cyber feeds, and so they're only actually hearing things that they've already decided they agree with. They're not being exposed to a range of ideas and possibilities. And so it becomes an echo chamber of their own views. And when people absorb their story, absorb their own history, their recent history, what happened 3 years ago, what happened 10 years ago, when they absorb that through an echo chamber, the danger is that they then become abusive to people that they don't agree with, because they lose respect for people who don't share that same echo chamber. And one of the great dangers of this cyber world in which we live, and we talked about it a bit in the last session, is the decline in respect for other people's views. And we've got somehow to go back to citizenship, integrity, meaning concern for the truth, and compassion for other people's views. And I really think if you put those three things together, citizenship, integrity, and compassion, then I think that we can find our way through the bad sides of cyber technologies and engage in the better sides and the good sides, of which overwhelmingly is what the cyber world provides for us.
There was a question here.
We're slightly going back, but is there not a giant conflict of interest between politicians who seek election via Facebook and advertising, and then expect them to turn around and control it?
Yeah. Most politicians that I know don't understand cyber. I mean, they're technologically illiterate, most of them. And so that's why they have contracts with companies like Cambridge Analytica, because somebody comes in and says, I can do this for you, I can do that, don't worry, leave it all to me. And they go down a rabbit hole which leads them into illegality sometimes. So I think, yes, there is a conflict, and I hope that a new generation of politicians, people who are now in their 20s and 30s, as they enter politics in the Western world, will be more technically astute than our present generation of politicians. And there's a bigger, you say, and I'm sure you'd agree with this, there's a bigger problem with politicians. I talk to lots of politicians. I hang around Westminster. I've been hanging around Westminster and Parliament for the last 25 years. I always say, it's like being a piano player in a brothel. You play the piano and you take an interest in what's going on. You just watch who comes and who goes, and it's, and I've been doing this for 25 years. And the politicians that you speak to, A lot of them will say, we know what we should do. We know exactly what we should do. What we don't know is how to win the election afterwards. If you do the right thing, you will lose the election. And their calculation is that by doing part of the right thing, you may win the next election, and then you can do a bit more of the right thing. But the number of times we've sat around tables at dinners and say, this is the problem. They say, yeah, I understand that, but we'd lose the election if we did it. I can't be seen to do it. I can't even be thought to do it. And that happens again and again and again. And there's no way around that. That is one of the difficulties of democracy, which is why it takes 3 and 4 governments, maybe more, to bring an idea to fruition, because people have got to do a little bit of it and maybe win the election, do a little bit and then lose, and then a new party does a little bit of it, and we get there. But again, going back to what I said about the 21st century, the degree of progress that has been made in some of the fundamentals of human existence is phenomenal. It really is phenomenal. What worries me is not that we're not making progress, but that we put that progress at risk by a lack of control, by careering away in the way we seem to be doing at the moment. That's my fear.
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So,
I understand what you mean by compassion and integrity. What I'm not clear about is citizenship. And I wondered if you could describe it a little bit more, what you think is citizenship. Because the problem is that it quickly becomes nationalism, and it could become something much bigger. And that's where I think a lot of the problems are. Surely we should be people of the world rather than citizens.
Yes, by citizenship I don't mean identity with the lowest possible unit, and I don't necessarily mean nationalism, although in itself there's nothing wrong with nationalism. I mean, all of us have a range of identities, so we can call ourselves a resident of the city, and we are a resident of the country, and we're a member of the European Union, and we belong to a number of minorities in our religion and our belief and so on. And it's the ability to understand that those identities are a complex mixture of things, rather than create one identity and say everything else is subordinate to the fact that I'm this nationality, or I'm this colour, or I'm this religion. That's when it becomes difficult. So citizenship is, first of all, an understanding of a mix of identities, which I think is important. The second element of citizenship is an understanding of political process, whatever it is. You remember I spoke about democracy and legitimacy. It so happens that in our system, in the Western world, we regard democracy as legitimate. It's not the case everywhere, but that's fine. We should look at what's legitimate. And in democracy, our form of legitimacy, what we should be most concerned about is that governments have to represent those who didn't vote for them. People have to have, as it were, concern for those who disagree with them. And that, to me, is citizenship. To say, we have lost the election, fine, it's your turn now, you take over, and we'll see how we do. And we will support you as far as we can. We don't like your policies on X and Y, and we'll oppose those, but we'll accept your policies on A, B, and C, and we'll do what we can to make them work. That, to me, is citizenship. It's the acceptance of the rules that we regard as legitimate. And there's not, I believe that in the Western world we are losing a lot of that citizenship. The polarization of our politics in several European countries, the United States has never been more polarized, and that's been going on since the first Bush administration, since 1990, not coincidentally, since the end of the 19th century, so the end of the 20th century, the beginning of our present era, 1991. That polarization in America has got deeper and deeper. And in Britain, the Brexit issue, the European Union issue, has polarized our society more deeply than I could ever have imagined, in a way that is very disturbing and distressing. And so that's what I mean by citizenship, an acceptance of multiple identities and an acceptance of the rules of the system, and an ability to want that system to persist. I mean, we can say lots of things about democracy, and famously, it's the worst possible system apart from all of the others, and it has all sorts of problems. But ultimately, it's a system that you have to want to believe in. At a national level, yes.
I was hoping to get the integrity concept at the state level. So you were mentioning about us as citizens in need for integrity. I was wondering. What would your thoughts be thinking of states like Turkey and Hungary within NATO, and how do the political changes in Hungary and Turkey affect the cohesion of the alliance, especially in spaces like the Black Sea?
Very badly. And I think what's happening in Hungary is very disturbing to any democrat because it's based on it seems to me it's based on half-truths and a degree of naked electioneering. What is happening in Turkey is actually more disturbing for the Western alliance. And there's an argument now for NATO. The idea that one of NATO's members is completely unhelpful to NATO, has been buying Russian air defense systems, is part of an arrangement with Iran and Syria to frustrate Western policy that has been pretty poor anyway in the Middle East, and still wants to be a NATO member, is very odd. And there's an argument which says that even if it would be very bad if Turkey left NATO, but it may be worse if Turkey like this stays in NATO. And there's a quiet argument going on now, not in public, but quietly at NATO and in Western capitals, which says, should we lay it on the line now to Erdogan to say, you either stay within NATO and embrace some of the ideals of NATO and of the European Union or Western European democracy, or accept that you will not be part of this community of nations. Now, we're not blameless in the way in which we have reacted to Turkey. Britain is extremely hypocritical in this. We have always supported Turkey's entry to the European Union because we knew it would never happen. We knew that France would always oppose it, so we said, fine, we'd love to have you in the Union, because we knew that it was easy to say because it wasn't a real possibility. At least the French were more honest about it than we were. And so we've got a real problem. Partly we've created the problem with Turkey, but Turkey has also gone off on a very strange line internationally. And what I would say about NATO now and the Western European nations, in 30-odd years of studying it, I have never known a time when the difference in the agendas between the northern members and the southern members was greater than it is now. In the north, in the Baltic states, in Scandinavia, in Germany, the agenda is all about Russia. In the south, it is all about refugees. And those two agendas are further apart now than I've ever known them. And NATO at 29 nations is not twice as strong as NATO at 16 nations. It's probably half as strong. I mean, NATO is getting weaker and weaker as it gets bigger because it cannot fulfill the responsibilities it has to all of those members. And so we really have a problem. And the United States is now taking a different view. Germany is a very different member of NATO than it was 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, Germany is almost a non-military power. Germany is so reluctant to be military. And when my friends in London, they complain the Germans won't do this and the Germans won't do that, I say, look, don't complain. This is the Germany we wished for 150 years. A civilian power that does not want to use its military. This is the Germany we wanted. So any future for NATO must be based on a rather different sort of alliance without Germany as its military core, and with the United States whose support is much more conditional than ever before. And we've got to try to work out what that might look like. And at the NATO summit on the 11th and 12th of July, we may get the first indications this year of how that new architecture might look. There are new command structures being set up, and we'll see really what Angela Merkel has to say and what Mr. Trump and his people have to say, and try and work it from there. But it's a very, very difficult time for NATO at the moment.
Okay, Raduca. And then one other question before we conclude.
Thank you. You've mentioned the 4 countries that are investing in cyber technology and weaponizing it, and I imagine this will probably add a new dimension to the hegemonic system. So my question is, will this lead to the emergence of new types of alliances, or does NATO, in the future, NATO and EU will be able to respond to the new threats that you've presented here?
No, it's a good point. I think it will certainly create new types of alliances and new types of arrangements. One thing I didn't mention, but which is very important when we think about China and Russia and the United States and India, is the Belt and Road Initiative, China's New Silk Road. It only started in 2013, so it's very new, it's only 5 years old. China has invested $900 trillion into it, $900 billion, nearly $1 trillion, into 6 routes across Asia into Europe. And they will change the balance of power across Asia. So it'll create a new series of great power dynamics across areas that ultimately matter to us and to the Middle East and to Turkey. And that will be important. Incidentally, in about 10 years' time, the Belt and Road Initiative will probably look like the most overt form of neo-colonialism since the 19th century. Because what China is doing is that they're creating all these facilities at huge rates of interest. They're lending money in Sri Lanka, Gwadar, the port of Gwadar in Pakistan. They've lent money at 14% interest. And when the Pakistani government defaults on the loan, as they surely will, the Chinese, instead of trying to restructure the loan, they'll just take the asset. That's what they've done in Sri Lanka. When the Western world lends money and a country defaults, we restructure it to get our money back. The Chinese don't want that. They take the asset. And so in about 10 years' time, China will own a lot of the assets for which they are now lending money across Asia, West Africa, parts of East Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of South and Southeastern Europe. So this is going to look very colonial, very imperial in about 10 years' time. But that is changing the politics of the areas that matter. I mean, India is ferociously opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative because it creates a new route and it privileges Afghanistan and Pakistan and possibly Iran at India's expense. And India and China are locked into now a real change in their relationships. They both think the other one is trying to surround them. They talk about the string of pearls, the Chinese naval bases in the Indian Ocean, and the Chinese worry that the Indians have moved all of their troops into the northeastern provinces, their troubled provinces of Tibet and Xinjiang. So both are now fear the other more than they've ever done since they fought a war in 1962. That's changing. And in relation to the United States, I mean, the phrase now is China goes global while America goes home. And that is probably true. China is certainly going global, no question. We're not sure if America is going home, but it looks as if it is. Under Trump, it certainly is. We'll see how long that lasts. But China goes global while America goes home. If that turns out to be the truth, then it will fundamentally affect the politics of NATO and the European Union. And those 28, 29, 30 countries of Europe will have to do much more in their own, not just physical defense, but their own technologies, their own political stability. And we've had a rather easy run for the last 20 years, since 1991 in Europe. And that easy run is coming to an end. And I think the more we realize that, the more we can actually adopt more imaginative policies for the 2020s. I'm presently trying to write about this at the moment, of security for the 2020s, so it's on my mind quite a lot.
Who wants to take the last question? Because I also have one, so it's not exactly the last one from the audience.
I'll be shorter.
In 1948, my late father, Jon Rațiu, wrote a book famously titled Moscow Challenges the World.
Yeah.
And I believe I'm right in thinking that the title was so unpopular in post-war Britain that the book wasn't actually published until about 1985. It's a knowledge of Jon Rațiu and his analysis of what may happen, no matter who is actually in Moscow. What would that title be, or might that title be today?
That book, Nikolai sent me a copy last year, and I was looking at it then. It was very interesting because it was very prophetic, actually. I can understand that the title wasn't popular in the late 1940s, but it was accepted certainly by the 1950s. If I had to write a title for a book like that now, and given that I think I'm quite snappy with titles, my title would be Moscow Runs Out of Time. because I think Russia is on the wrong side of history. It's a big country. It is a special country with a wonderful culture. Its GDP is smaller than Italy's, smaller than Britain's. It is locked in an economic system that is controlled by a group of oligarchs and it cannot reform itself while that persists. And Putin has always said we have a Eurasian mission. Well, that's not going very well, because Russia has essentially been thrown out of Central Asia by Chinese influence in all the stands, in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. China, the Belt and Road Initiative is just one big example. China has expelled Russian influence from Central Asia. And when you think about Russia's or Putin's relationship with Xi Jinping, I noticed he won an award. Xi Jinping has given him an award yesterday, and that's a sign that he knows that he's lost. When you give people an award, it's like that's fine. The discrepancy in power and potential is so great. China believes, as so does India, that time is on their side, that the 21st century is the century of Asia, the Asiatic century. And that is almost certainly true. If you draw a circle around South China, Southeast Asia and India, more than half of the world's population lives inside that circle. Right? And that's not going to change. That's important. And Russia finds that very, very hard to accept. And in Europe, Western Europe and the United States handled Russia very badly after 1991. I won't go into it, but take it from me, we did not do ourselves any favors. And that has left Russia with a sense of resentment. And President Putin, in his speech to the Duma in February or March 2014, he made a very important speech for the 21st century. He said, what happened in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed was a catastrophe. That was the phrase he used. It was a catastrophe. And he said, and we must do all, at the time we were too weak to oppose it, but we must do all we can to reverse the effects of it. And so what President Putin is trying to do, though he is running out of time to do it, because Russia's power, its global power is diminishing, not increasing, he's running out of time to recreate influence in the old Soviet space. Now, and I don't mean that is physical invasion, but influence through cyber, through culture, through political maneuvering, through what's called hybrid competition these days, and he's doing it quite well because we're letting it happen. And so I think if I had to think of a title, it would be Moscow Runs Out of Time. There's a famous book now by Graham Allison called the Thucydides Trap, which is about America and China, but it's based on an old idea. Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, he said that a rising power and a declining power will tend to go to war, because the rising power feels resentful and the declining power realizes that if they don't do it soon, it'll soon be too late. And the argument is America and China falling into the Thucydides trap? But the same could partly be true in relation to Western Europe and Russia. Is there a Thucydides trap developing, whereby we feel that we're in different scales and the confrontation is better sooner rather than later? I hope that is not true, but it's a possibility. Thank you. Pleasure.
Okay, so I have a final question, and I don't mean to be the one to draw the conclusions, because again there have been so many issues raised here. We heard a lot of stuff going from very broad global topics, going all the way to how citizens should behave. We heard about the big four countries that are, advancing in technology, in the military, in influence at the global level. Out of those four, one of them is, okay, maybe capitalism, but it's definitely not a democracy. The other two are, or claim to be democracies, but we all know that's not so much the case. While the fourth one is still a democracy, but it's definitely looking inwards. Here in Europe, as you said, we are basically, all of us as Europeans, fighting for relevance at the global stage.
Yeah.
And We are doing that as the European Union. We are doing that at the level of states. We are trying, even outside the European Union or NATO, to find alliances at a more narrow level that are more functional, and those are more or less efficient. At the same time, at the level of citizens, there is a lot of lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of what's going on around us.
Yeah.
And the elections everywhere in Europe in the past years are showing that. And even in Romania, and many of us here Romanians know that quite well, we are coming after several years of protesting, constant protesting, even nowadays, because of the bad behavior of politicians or political elites, while at the same time other citizens, exactly at this hour, are holding their own protest, fighting for the other side, claiming to be even more or even better citizens than the other ones. And if you're stuck somewhere in the middle and outside those bubbles, you're probably left wondering what exactly is going on. So you covered all this in your speech, and all of us here in this room are people who are active in our communities. I'm pretty sure we are trying to do right things as citizens and as members of the political body and with respect to the political system. But if you had in mind, if you are speaking to a bunch of students now, to a group of your students, what would be your final message to those students, and that they would take, after hearing everything that you said, that they would take further on, and internalize in their daily lives?
Yeah, okay. Also, the message to students is don't run out of hope. Remember that analysts are paid to be pessimistic. That's the point. If you're optimistic, nobody listens to what you say. If you're paid to recognize all of the problems, and as analysts, we try to get the balance right. But the most important thing, George, in terms of, what do people do who see these political bubbles all the time? And the answer lies in the political culture of our own societies. And that political culture should be nurtured by discussion, by think tanks, by universities, by institutes, the sorts of things that the Rațiu Foundation has tried to do, has succeeded in doing, but tries to do throughout Romania, are not just nice things to have, they are necessary. You cannot function politically without a political community of people who are talking and discussing and bringing others in. And it's not that we all have to be politicos. You don't all have to be piano players in the brothel, but you have to take people have to have some sense that there's an interest out there. And again, around Westminster, there are a whole series of little streets around Westminster, Great George Street and Smith Street and so on. And every night of the week, there are hundreds of dinners taking place in clubs and at restaurants in those little streets, and I go to quite a few of them. And at those dinners there will be ex-ministers, politicians, academics, there'll be scientists, and political parties don't matter at all. And I've sat in those dinners and I've heard ex-ministers say, when I was minister for this, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea what was going on. Civil servants told me this, I wasn't sure, I just went with it. They're very honest. Usually when they're retired, but they're very honest about what they do. But that's all part of a vigorous political culture. And when we talk to students, as you and I both do, we always say to them, be part of the political culture. You don't have to be a policy wonk. You don't have to be obsessive, but you want to be part of the conversations that should go on in every city as a matter of course about politics and things that matter to people. Don't leave it to professional politicians, because politics is about everyone.
So enjoy the rest of the week and maybe see you next year.